A bed still warm, yet untouched by sleep. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallo. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Hearing from you makes this channel feel alive. Let's uncover the case. I remember the evening with unnecessary clarity. The sort of damp, insistent drizzle that turns Oxford's cobbles into mirrors had begun around 5, and by 7 the streets of Jericho were reduced to quiet shapes beneath umbrellas. I had chosen the pub not for warmth, though the hearth was lit, but for its anonymity. One can disappear in a public house more effectively than in one's own room, and that night the impulse to be unseen was stronger than usual. I carried the Times folded under my arm, the crossword already half filled with hesitant ink. The place smelt of wood polish and old hops, that curious mixture which, when mingled with wet coats, carries a faint melancholy all of its own. A porter from St. John's coughed discreetly in the corner, nursing half a bitter. Students shuffled by the window, shoes squeaking faintly as they headed toward their lodgings. I thought of beds and fires and company, and then, inevitably, of absence. I had just written in the word somnolent across the bottom left of the grid when I caught a phrase from the bar. 2 men, indistinct in the half-light, were engaged in a discussion more earnest than the ale warranted. One spoke of Houseman, though his citation was clumsy. The line, he said with authority, was about love's warmth being wasted, but he rendered it wrongly, exchanging fond for false. The error lodged like grit in the shoe. I have never been able to let such misquotations pass, not even in memory. The misstep drew me away from the crossword, and my mind wandered into the spaces Houseman always leaves, those lonely stretches between affection and futility. Beds, I thought, are often judged by the warmth they contain, yet it is possible for warmth to exist without sleep, for bodies to share space and remain strangers to rest. I have known such nights, when fatigue is present, but sleep withholds its mercy, when closeness only magnifies distance. The overheard line, imperfect though it was, carried me there again. The crossword before me seemed suddenly inadequate, its clues pedestrian, its little black squares too neatly bound. I stared at one clue in particular. Without sleep, yet not alone. 7. I had penciled in insomni in error, before realizing the extra syllable betrayed me. I scratched it out irritably. Words matter more than most people suspect. The wrong one distorts the whole. A bed, too, is easily misread. One sees creased linen and imagines comfort, but there are beds that tell of quarrels, departures, or worse. The porter coughed again, and I looked at him without meaning to. His eyes darted to the window as though Oxford's misted panes might conceal something worth watching. I returned to my crossword, though the letters no longer aligned themselves willingly. Perhaps it was the drizzle, or the dull ache of whiskey behind my eyes, but I could not shake the thought of that misquoted verse. It reminded me of nights when I had left a light burning, though no one was expected, as though the mere preparation of a room might conjure a guest. Futile gestures that reveal more than they conceal. I ordered another measure, listened to the rain pressing against the glass, and wondered what beds that night were being warmed by absence. The city is full of them, though the college walls keep their secrets well. In libraries the smell of paper conceals longing. In chapels the echoes of prayer drown out disquiet. Yet beds betray. The impression of a body remains when the body has gone. It was then, still turning over the false Houseman line, that I noticed the crossword clue anew. Without sleep, yet not alone. The answer, so obvious once grasped, was restive. Not restless, as one might expect, but restive, a subtler condition, a refusal of repose rather than an inability. I circled it, pleased and faintly unsettled, for the distinction seemed to echo the thought that had already taken hold. Warmth does not guarantee peace. Presence does not assure companionship. I drained the glass and the rain thickened outside. Somewhere A church bell marked the hour, soft against the wet air. The men at the bar had fallen silent, their talk of poetry exhausted. Yet the misquote lingered, stubborn as a bruise. I have learned, in such moments, not to dismiss what clings. Small inaccuracies often point toward larger falsehoods. A word changed, a bed warmed, a story told too smoothly. Such things rarely exist without consequence. I folded the paper carefully, as though the unsolved half might wait for me with patience, and stepped back into the drizzle. Oxford's stones gleamed black, and the streets were emptying toward hidden courtyards, toward staircases where keys would turn and doors close. The night was one of stillness, but the stillness did not soothe. I walked slowly, thinking of warmth without sleep, of company that fails to comfort, and of the way a single line, misremembered, might lead the mind astray. 700 words or not, that night was the beginning. The letter arrived in the graceless way such things do, folded too tightly, addressed to no one, and therefore to me. Lewis placed it on my desk with the ceremony he reserves for items that never go away because we wish them to. "Anonymous, sir," Strange says, crank. I let the envelope rest a breath, then opened it. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. There was other matter, dutiful outrage, but the single sentence held like a nail in timber. I read it again. The words were ordinary, the order was not. Lewis shifted, patient. "The rest hints at saint." "All dates," he said. "Retired Don, found dead last week. College doctor signed it off. Only the scout mentioned the bed, warm and disturbed. He gave disturbed a neutral tone, the decent way to say uneasy. Officially it was nothing. Universities prefer tragedies domesticated by Latin and tea. Yet warmth is a stubborn residue. It clings after sense has gone hard. I asked for particulars, and Lewis obliged in his register. Dr. Arthur Mallory, classicist, unmarried, precise to the point of grievance, given to long walks and short patience. The sort of life Oxford overlooks until it ends. I told Lewis the tense was peculiar, was warm, not had been. He said perhaps the writer's grammar failed them. Perhaps, I said, the writer's memory refuses to move on. We walked to Saint, old dates under a sky that threatened rain, and, out of self-importance, withheld it. The lodge smelled of polish and damp wool. A porter with a face arranged for veto escorted us through corridors where floorboards practiced discretion. He did not say welcome. He showed us the way as one shows an exit. Mallory's rooms had been tidied with anxious competence, an order that cannot conceal small rebellions. A ring on the desk where a glass had stood. 2 volumes returned in the wrong precedence, Hesiod meekly leading Homer. The bed was eloquent in its own dialect. The creases ran lengthwise. The pillow dent was not a cradle for a skull, but a shallow depression, as if a hand had pressed and withdrawn. Someone had needed proximity and not rest. Lewis repeated the doctor's view. Heart failure, regrettable but commonplace. I told him sadness dislikes the passive. He attempted a smile the room had no use for. The scout, he said, found the window ajar and the sash stiff. I tested the hinge and saw graphite on the joint, a smear too deliberate for dust. The ashtray was empty, yet smelt of struggle. People fight the urge to smoke by tidying and seldom win. On the mantel lay Mallory's spectacles with one arm bent. I straightened it, then reversed the correction. A man may live crooked and see truly, or live straight and miss everything. Lewis asked whether I wished to disturb the master. Not yet. Masters like endings, I have an unhelpful taste for beginnings. A small deduction arrived unannounced. The bed told of a visitor too tense for sleep and too careful for comfort. The graphite suggested fingers accustomed to pencils or shutters. The books whispered haste. None of it proved malice. All of it refused indifference. The sentence from the letter brushed my sleeve again. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. Warmth without sleep implies presence that will not yield. It implies a watcher. I have known nights when remaining awake was kinder than closing one's eyes, and others when kindness had nothing to do with anything. Perhaps Mallory kept vigil, perhaps someone kept it for him. We left. The corridor creaked once, like a confession made to itself. Outside, the air smelt of stone from recent rain, although none fell. Officially, the matter remained nothing. To me, it had already become the familiar everything, a thought that refuses dismissal, a room that has not finished speaking, a bed that remembers what it will not say. St. Aldate's stood half-hidden behind its gates, stones softened by centuries of drizzle, ivy clinging with the patience of old grudges. Lewis walked beside me, his pace brisk, mine slower, reluctant. Colleges are not kind to strangers and less so to policemen. Inside, the quadrangle lay quiet, puddles reflecting pale October light. The air smelt of paper stored too long, of rain seeping into mortar, of something half resigned to permanence. The master received us first. His rooms were orderly, though the man himself was not. He carried his weariness like an untied gown, slipping at the shoulder, too close to falling. He spoke of Mallory with carefully measured sadness, each word polished but fragile, a fine scholar, a life given to service, a sudden end. He did not say inconvenient, though it hovered there. He offered tea, poured with a tremor disguised as courtesy, and spoke of heart failure as one speaks of punctuation, an inevitability, not a tragedy. Lewis asked where the master had been the evening Mallory died. Dining out, he said, and glanced at the clock as though rehearsing the memory even now. He named his companions, a list heavy with names designed to discourage disbelief. I did not contradict him, but I noticed the tea tray had only one cup, though he had spoken of company earlier. Loneliness lingers on porcelain more surely than fingerprints. The bursar followed, summoned with reluctance. He was a man whose spectacles gleamed more than his eyes, whose calculations never strayed beyond the ledger. He told us Mallory had been a difficult tenant, irregular payments, complaints about heating, a tendency to hoard volumes. Death, he suggested, relieved the college of an inconvenience. He spoke smoothly, each phrase cool as stone, but his fingers tapped against the desk, counting something invisible. When pressed, he said he had been working late in the accounts room. No witness, but figures, he insisted, do not lie. I thought of all the figures that had lied to me before. It was the fellow who intrigued me most. He was younger, with hair untidy, and eyes that carried a residue of sleepless nights. He spoke warmly of Mallory, too warmly, the way affection sometimes conceals bitterness. He described the old Don's devotion to teaching, his love of poetry, his endless corrections in the margins of essays. Then he paused, and with an air of triumph quoted Virgil, "Omnia vincit amor, nos cedamus amori." Love conquers all, let us yield to love. Except, he said, sedamus instead of sedamus. A future where there should have been a present, a slip, barely perceptible, but to me it tolled louder than the chapel bell. One does not misquote Virgil if one truly means it. One misquotes when the phrase is rehearsed rather than lived. I said nothing, only stored it away. A crossword clue answered too quickly is seldom answered well. The college itself pressed on me with its weight. Corridors where portraits stared from gilt frames, men long dead whose eyes refused to look away. Floorboards that surrendered their groans unwillingly. The library door left ajar, its darkness breathing paper and ink. This was not merely an institution, it was a body with organs failing quietly, history pumping through veins that no longer reached the extremities. Lewis muttered afterwards that they all seemed convincing, which, of course, is exactly the problem. Everyone in Oxford is convincing. Conviction is its currency. Yet what matters are the cracks, the tea tray with one cup, the fingers tapping figures not spoken, the Virgil that stumbled into the wrong tense. We left under a sky that promised rain without delivering it, and I felt the college closing behind us, the gate iron against my back. Its shadows lingered, though the evening had not yet begun. Lewis asked what I made of them, and I said only that truth, like ivy, takes years to show its damage. He frowned, but I let the words hang. Some thoughts cannot be hurried, not even by duty. Lewis had the photograph spread out on the table as though it were evidence beyond debate. A discovery, he called it, and his tone held the faint pride of a man who has brought something tangible into a room full of shadows. The image itself was not large, sepia edges softening into cream, the figures preserved with a stillness that time itself must have envied. Dr. Mallory stood stiffly at the centre, waistcoat buttoned too high, hair carefully obedient, his expression fixed in that ambiguous Oxford smile which promises erudition but little else. At his side a woman, much younger, her features delicate yet unyielding, a gaze directed not toward the camera but somewhere slightly beyond it, as though watching an idea pass by. She was, Lewis told me, a former pupil who had since made a name for herself as a poet of some acclaim. I nodded, feigning casual recognition, though the name stirred faint bells I could not immediately place. What caught me was not her face, nor Mallory's, but the hand. Her right hand rested at her side, the wrist turned outward, fingers bent slightly away, a gesture of withdrawal so quiet one might have overlooked it. Lewis, eager to impress, spoke of the intimacy suggested by their proximity. I let him finish before murmuring that intimacy and distance can be neighbours. His brow furrowed, unpersuaded. He saw two figures close enough to imply closeness. I saw a refusal disguised as stillness. I studied the photograph again, more slowly the second time, because the second reading often yields the truth the first one conceals. The faint crease across the woman's sleeve suggested the picture had been carried, folded, perhaps hidden, in a book. Lovers preserve, scholars archive, but the guilty conceal. Lewis remarked that she looked beautiful. I replied, perhaps too quickly, that poets seldom resemble their poems. He chuckled at my cynicism, but I masked what was not cynicism at all, something nearer to intrigue or longing. A foolish thing for a man of my years, but foolishness is sometimes the only thing that keeps one alive. We traced her name, Clara Winters, through the college records. She had studied English under Mallory in her final year, written a dissertation on the elegiac tradition, left with a first, and then vanished into the larger world of literary magazines and readings in dimly lit halls. Her poetry, I remembered now, had been praised for its clarity, its refusal to yield to sentiment, lines that sliced rather than soothed. It was not difficult to imagine her resisting Mallory's attention, nor difficult to imagine Mallory mistaking her sharpness for invitation. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him Mallory may have been fond of his student, but fondness is often a poor disguise for hunger. He raised an eyebrow, perhaps discomfited by my candour, and said the photograph suggested more. I said photographs always suggest more, precisely because they cannot say enough. He laughed uneasily, then grew quiet. Later, alone, I kept the image on my desk longer than necessary. I traced her hand with my eyes, the angle of retreat, the refusal to rest in his presence. I wondered whether she had written of him in verse, whether hidden among her stanzas lay a coded dismissal, a refusal turned lyrical. I had no evidence, only suspicion, but suspicion has led me more faithfully than proof on more than one occasion. A small deduction flickered. The photograph bore an embossed mark in the corner. Kingsley and Sons, Broad Street. A studio known for formal commissions rather than casual portraits. Such places seldom admit spontaneity. Which meant that she had been asked, perhaps pressed, to attend. Her refusal, then, had been confined to gesture alone. I felt the weight of it, a silence stronger than speech. Lewis returned with tea, muttering about the weather and the damp creeping into his bones. He asked if I found the woman interesting. I said only that poets make unreliable companions, too much in love with words to grant loyalty to people. He chuckled, satisfied with the jest, and did not notice how long my eyes lingered on the photograph. The rain tapped the window, persistent as thought. Somewhere in the distance, the bell of Saint Mary's tolled the hour with weary patience. I sat back, glass in hand, and felt the room narrow around me. Not because of Mallory, not because of the anonymous letter, but because of the woman whose hand in the photograph spoke louder than any of their voices. 700 words, no more, and still her hand refuses to let me go. I returned to Mallory's rooms in the late afternoon, when chapel light laid pale ladders across the quad. The scout had left the fire laid and the curtains half drawn, as if warmth and secrecy had been negotiated but not agreed. I told Lewis I would be a minute. His footsteps receded quietly. From the door the bed looked obedient, white, tidied, sheet folded to an exact width that promised surrender. Close up, the promise failed. The linen had been stirred without the rhythm of sleep, turbulence confined to the center, the pillows pressed in shallow ovals that denied the weight of a skull. The scout had said warm. I placed my palm against the sheet and felt only the memory of heat the residue places retain when bodies change their minds. Why prepare a bed so carefully and refuse it? Why disturb it so fully and leave no imprint? I have known hospital corners maintained by men more afraid of disorder than pain, lovers who undressed a bed like a barricade, then dressed it again by daylight. This was neither caution nor passion. It was theatre. Someone had staged sleep and withheld it. On the bedside table lay the Times, folded with authority. I turned to the crossword and found 3 entries in Mallory's precise, bullying hand. One made me pause, for the clue I had noticed in the pub, sleepless but not alone, he had written restless. Restless is the answer a tired mind reaches. Restive is the answer a truthful one avoids. To be restive is to refuse repose, not merely fail to find it. The bed agreed. The blankets showed a faint grey along the hem, the imprint of a coat placed across the foot and lifted again. The window was raised a fraction. The sash left a smear of graphite on my fingers when I tested the latch. Pencil on wood, the nervous guide of someone marking where to stop, or an absent habit carried from paper to paint. Lewis's voice arrived and withdrew. Anything? Only the usual, I said. I tried the ritual. Sit at the edge, lift the sheet, abandon it, touch the pillow, withdraw. Repeat, as if surrender could be rehearsed into courage. The mattress yielded. Mallory had argued and lost, or someone had argued in his stead. There was no glass on the table, but a ring on the desk testified to winter whiskey. The hearth was laid, but unstruck. Men who intend to sleep bank fires, men who intend to leave, admire their arrangement and go. Beneath the pillow lingered a thread of camphor and something neutral. Care makes a good alibi until questioned. The anonymous sentence returned with the soft obstinacy of rain. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. Warmth without sleep implies presence that will not yield, the heat of a vigil. Had Mallory watched for someone who failed to come, or watched over someone who came and would not remain? Had 2 occupied the evening and only one the room? The arithmetic would not behave. A deduction flickered and refused its name. The coat hem, the graphite, the unlit fire, the wrong answer. Everything proposed company, nothing admitted it. Rooms perform, staging innocence so earnestly that the performance becomes evidence. Here the performance concerned refusal. When I left, I smoothed the coverlet with the flat of my hand, an absurd courtesy to an hour I had not lived. The corridor received me with an indifferent creak. From the stair, Lewis asked whether the bed had spoken. Only that it prefers rehearsal to truth, I said. He said that sounded like most people. Perhaps. Outside, the quad kept its bluish hour. I lit a cigarette I did not want and watched the flame surrender. Behind me, the bed remained warm in theory, cold in fact, and the metaphor tugged again, almost remembered, and unwisely pursued. The case tried to close itself around the bursar the way ivy reclaims stone, slowly, confidently. Lewis brought statements and a certainty he wore like a new coat. People saw him near Mallory's staircase late, sir. And there's money, always money. He looked relieved to find a door that opened on the first push. We returned to St. Old dates, as the afternoon thinned, the lodge smelled of polish and resignation. In the passage, a strip of carpet had been replaced. The new colour sat like a bruise. The bursar received us with a face that had practised neutrality to boredom. He gestured to chairs and arranged papers in an order suggesting rehearsal and brevity. He spoke of endowments, heating budgets, Mallory's habit of claiming for petty repairs that never quite rose to necessity. Mallory liked small wars, he told us. The college had larger battles. When Lewis asked about his presence near the rooms, the fingers began their tapping, first on the ledger, then on the chair arm. "I lock the accounts room at 10, he said. "I make a round. A round is not suspicious." He permitted a crack of irritation when I asked about window hinges. "We oil them quarterly," he answered, as though the quarter absolved. He produced a ruled notebook. The page for last week bore a neat tick beside Mallory's set. Graphite. Confirmed. Beneath it, as an afterthought, a line that caught and held, bed warm, room otherwise in order. Lewis, hearing the alibi tighten, nodded as if to say, "There we are." I heard another thing entirely, an echo from the anonymous letter. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. The bursar had not said no one slept, but the rhythm leaned the same way, the little theatre of observation intact. He had not been the scout. Why did he speak like one? He caught my glance and coloured a shade that did not suit him. "You read too much into notes, Inspector. Notes are for people with memory to spare." I thought of men who trust ledgers to forgive them, and said little. He resumed a recital of balances and deficits, a hum that might have anaesthetised guilt if guilt required help. In the corridor, Lewis whispered that the bursar's nerves gave him away. "Only guilty men tap." "Tired men," I replied. He reminded me of witnesses. The porter had seen a silhouette at 10:30, narrow shoulders, a quick turn. It suited the bursar. We visited the accounts room. It smelt of paper and a dust that believes in immortality. In the wastebasket lay a torn envelope with a Broad Street stamp, Kingsley and Sons, the studio that had taken Clara Winters's photograph. I kept my hand from it and filed the coincidence where all coincidences go, the middle drawer of distrust. On the windowsill, a faint smear of graphite marked the point where a sash would rest, if raised exactly so. His rounds had a metronome. Efficiency can be an alibi when it travels in straight lines. Crime prefers the curve you miss while watching the clock. Back with the bursar, I asked the smallest question I could phrase. "Who told you the bed was warm?" He blinked. "The scout, of course. And you wrote it down because?" "Because it was unusual. Men like him dislike the unusual. They price it out and call it a saving." He said he wanted the paperwork to match the truth. Paper rarely does. By evening, Lewis had built a scaffold, money to skim, a presence near the rooms, a temper, smoothed by decimals but prone, like all tempers, to spike. I poured 2 whiskies and let him speak until the case looked neat. Then I remembered the line in the ledger and the echo it made. "Neatness," I told him, "is a vice I distrust. Beds that lie prefer tidy endings. Lives do not." Outside, the quad surrendered to rain. Drops struck the flagstones and spread into ovals. Under the arch, I felt the college breathe. The case leaned toward the bursar, but the cadence was wrong, borrowed from another voice. Somewhere the original waited, patient as paper in the dark. The college cellar felt like a chapel that had chosen comfort over piety. Stone cool as withheld advice, a fug of cork and damp oak, bottles with dust soft as ash along their shoulders. The romantic Don guided me down as if eloquence were a key that opened even iron. "We should drink to Mallory," he said in that fluent way of his, claret deciding matters better than light. I let him choose the year. He performed modesty as a flourish and called it nothing. We sat beneath a humming lamp. He began with praise, not grief. Mallory's lectures were symphonies, he said, Greek made present tense, young minds set alight. The admiration had been rehearsed into smoothness. A tremor showed beneath, like a pulse one tries not to feel. I asked about Mallory outside the lecture hall. A bachelor's housekeeping, he smiled, impeccable but dull. He poured. The wine was dark and patient. He spoke of poetry as if it were a country that had granted him citizenship. Yeats, most of all, he said. Love is awful and full of sleep. The key scraped in the lock. Awful, not awful. And not that line. I allowed the stumble to stand. Men who wear poetry as a uniform seldom misbutton it unless haste or vanity has frayed the cloth. He kept talking, naming sonnets like acquaintances, arranging cadences in little altars. His left hand attended the stem, the right stayed near the table's shadow. A pale circle showed where a ring had lately lived. I did not ask whom it had betrayed. I felt envy and distrust arrive arm in arm. Some men move through speech like a bicycle through lanes. I push mine uphill and stop for breath. Envy is useful. It keeps the ear awake. He inquired whether I believed the rumors. Which ones? I said. The ones that breed behind doors, he answered. That Mallory formed attachments unsuited to the college's decorum. Men like him love minds, not bodies. The sentence drifted between us like incense and left a scent I could not trust. His evening then, hall, a walk under dripping cloisters, a stop at chapel to hear a rehearsal, home to write. Love has its notes and its rests, he added lightly, and then, with deliberate care, I was alone. The claret trembled under the lamp like a moon. I thought of Clara Winters and the turned wrist in the photograph, refusal made elegant. Perhaps minds were safer than bodies. Perhaps bodies had ceased to answer him. A small deduction presented itself, unguided. His praise avoided Mallory's last few terms. The past was clear, the present smudged. When asked for a recent memory, he reached again for Yeats, and again the verse slid a half step from accuracy. Grief, I suggested, rearranges what it cannot bear to display. He accepted at once, relieved by the furniture I offered. Before we left, I touched the label. A year Mallory might have coveted. Who pays for this? I asked. The college cellar, he said, and a pause gathered moss. He emptied the rest into my glass as if to drown the hesitation. We climbed the stairs. Stone gave our feet their obedient echo. At the door he said, Mallory loved order because love itself was chaos. Order hides fear, I said. He smiled the way good talkers smile when a truth arrives wearing their clothes. Night waited in the quad like an unasked question. Later, Lewis wondered what I made of the fellow. His words are beautiful, I said, and beauty, like claret, stains. Something thickened beneath the recital, jealousy or pride, or a grievance preserved in brine. I could not name it. But the Yeats that slipped kept its coin weight in my pocket, and I turned it over in the dark as we walked, listening to metal speak a language older than trust. It was Lewis who found it. He came back from the college archives with a faint air of triumph, the kind a man acquires when he has dug through dust and paper only to bring forth something tangible. A diary, he said, belonged to Clara Winters during her last year here. He placed it on the table in front of me, and for a moment the cracked leather binding seemed more eloquent than any living witness. The smell of it was the first thing I noticed. Old paper and faint lavender, a mixture that suggested the hands which once turned its pages did so with care. Lewis sat back while I leafed through. The script was delicate, slanted, full of crossings out that revealed a restless mind, unwilling to leave words untested. Entries about lectures, about poems half-drafted, about the weather on Magdalen Bridge, ordinary fragments that seemed to resist the gravity of tragedy. Then came the gap. A month nearly whole, excised. A careful tear, not a clumsy accident. The missing leaves left a faint shadow of fibres, a pale rectangle where ink should have lived. My fingers lingered there longer than they should have. The silence was louder than any of the surviving pages. Lewis, eager as always, asked if I thought it significant. I told him significance is not always written down. He frowned. He wanted words to confess. I wanted silence to speak. I read again from the weeks before the gap. Mallory is impossible today. He insists the Greeks did not feel grief as we do. Later, Mallory brought me a book of elegies, said I should mark what I find true. Later still. Strange how a man can appear kind when he is only curious. These fragments ended, and then the page was gone. The next entry resumed, as though time had passed without air. It is spring again, and the gardens are louder with blossoms than with people. The missing month was when she had worked most closely with him. She had mentioned his lectures, his suggestions, his unwanted gifts. Then nothing. A silence torn free, deliberate as an oath. I turned the diary over in my hands, letting the weight of its absences press against me. A confession is sometimes a word spoken, sometimes it is an omission. One tears away what one cannot permit to remain, yet the act of tearing leaves its own scar. I told Lewis as much, though he shook his head. "If the page is gone, sir, how can it help?" "Because it is gone," I replied. He left to check other records. I remained, reading what was left, which was less compelling than what was not. The thought nagged, who removes a page? The writer herself, protecting dignity, hiding weakness, shielding another? Or someone else later, fearing what those words might reveal? Both possibilities unsettled me in different registers. My mind drifted to crosswords again. There was once a clue I struggled with. The unsaid speaks louder than the spoken. 6. The answer was ellipse. A truncation of ellipsis. Words omitted, silence marked, meaning suggested but withheld. It returned to me now like a warning. When Lewis came back, he said the archivist remembered the diary being donated some years ago by a woman in haste. She had handed it over without ceremony, signed the slip, and walked out quickly. Clara Winters herself then. A deliberate relinquishing. She had not wanted to keep it, but neither had she wished to destroy it outright. That uneasy middle ground where guilt and pride meet. The rain began against the windows, soft at first, then steadier, like fingers rehearsing a confession they would never complete. I closed the diary and left it on the desk. The gap inside it was heavier than any entry. That night, alone, I thought about Clara Winters, about her hand turned away in the photograph, about the page she had removed. Words and gestures conspired in their silence. I wondered if she wrote poems to replace what she had torn. I wondered if Mallory had read them, and whether he understood. Absence is not empty. It contains all that was too dangerous to remain. 700 words, and still the silence speaks. Louder I slept, as one does in borrowed weather, never entirely inside it. The rain had thinned to a mist against the window, and somewhere a late bus sighed along Banbury Road. I drifted into the room at St. Aldate's, the bed waiting with its white argument, the coverlet feigning innocence. A hand lay where a head should have been. Not mine, not hers. Memory had left a shape and refused to explain it. The warmth existed before I reached it. That was the trouble. I stood at the threshold and felt it lift to meet me, as if the bed remembered. Clara's turned wrist hovered at the edge of the scene, the photograph refusing to be still. I asked the room what it concealed, and the room asked for conditions. Dreams prefer conditions. I woke in the failing dark with the old ache in my shoulder. The letter was where I had left it, folded twice, as if someone had tried to halve its meaning. I read without the lamp, feeling the hollows of the words with my thumb. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. The sentence did not grant me peace, it granted me grammar. Was warm, not had been warm. A thing reported from within its moment, not after the fact. I saw again the scout's note under the bursar's ticking hand, bed warm, room otherwise in order. The same theatre, the same refusal to move along the timeline. It sounded less like observation than performance, an echo rehearsed until it could be trusted to say itself. I crossed to the window. Oxford is a cathedral emptied of its choir. I thought of the sash in Mallory's room, the graphite smear, the bed that preferred rehearsal to truth. If the bed was warm, someone stood there when it mattered. If it had been warm, they had already woven their alibi and gone. The difference is a hinge that will not open unless coaxed. Lewis had told me not to worry the tenses, that people do not speak with grammars, they speak with nerves. Perhaps. But nerves leave tenses where fingerprints will not. I read the letter a third time and felt the phrase lean forward, like a witness trying to see whether I would notice the mistake they could not help making. 2 accounts, I thought, or one voice borrowed by another. The scout's phrasing had been blunt, the bursar's neat. The letter carried both temperatures. I made tea and watched steam fog the pane. I considered who writes anonymously about a bed, a lover who will not be named, a servant who will not be heard, a colleague who will not be implicated. Each would choose a different tense, a different distance from the heat. The letter had chosen the middle ground where cowards and guardians meet. Clarity does not arrive, it assembles, a shard from the cellar, a smudge from the sash, a misquoted Yeats, a ring removed, a diary page excised. Now the verb. The case had been content to live in nouns. I went back to bed and lay on my side as if listening could be done with the body alone. Sleep returned and brought the room with it. This time the woman did not appear, the bed breathing. I reached out and found heat without weight. Someone had stood there, not sleeping, not leaving, performing the idea of presence until the clock could forgive them. When I woke again, the light had begun, and I no longer wanted the lamp. Doubt, sharp as a pin, had become a tack that would hold. The letter was not a confession, it was a rehearsal of one. The voice in it belonged to 2 mouths, or to one that had learned its part from another. I dressed without hurry. Outside, the city prepared its disguises. Inside, a verb had chosen me, and I let it. She asked to meet by the river where the willows lean as if eavesdropping. The afternoon kept a milky light over Christchurch meadow. Paths were softened by last night's rain. She arrived with the haste of one who has rehearsed courage and fears it will fade if kept waiting. I knew her from the photograph, the same reserve about the mouth, the same refusal in the eyes. I said her name as if returning a book. She said she had belonged to Mallory and sorrow had come late. Confessions choose their weather. We walked because chairs would have made it melodrama. She spoke quickly, as though the tale had been filed and needed only retrieving. He admired my poems. He was lonely. He taught me to read elegy without sentiment. I told her loneliness and instruction are poor tutors in love. She pressed on, grateful for correction because it granted her a wound. We met in his rooms, she said, and I was cruel to him sometimes. That word did not suit her mouth. The meadow smelt of damp grass and diesel. She described a winter of stealthy happiness, lectures, marginal notes, a glass he kept for her that never appeared in the college accounts. It sounded plausible enough to warm a bed. I felt the old ache one feels when desire borrows an academic gown and calls itself destiny. He made me copy out prayers from Donne, she said. He called the body a text and the text a body. I let the claim walk beside us a few paces, then laid it gently on the table between us. Mallory did not teach Donne. His set texts ran ancient and dry. She recovered with elegance, said he set Donne privately, that the true work happened outside the syllabus. Possible, Oxford prefers unofficial corridors. Still, something in the cadence jarred. I asked which poem had sealed it. She let the wind move her hair into a more tragic shape and answered, the canonization. She gave 2 lines almost right, and not right enough, and said, he loved the place where lovers are named saints. I let the river speak. In Mallory's supervision notes, which I had read in 3 files, Donne was dismissed as clever grief. He would not have called lovers saints. He distrusted canon and conjugation in the same breath. We stopped near the barges. You were not his, I said, and kept the gentleness I could afford. You wanted to be something else, and afterwards you wanted the wanting to have been noble. She stared at the water until it failed to agree. I told her I did not mind the lie, I minded the rehearsal. Your words wear two tenses at once. He was warm to you, and he is warm now because you are telling it. The bed cannot hold both. She took diary leaves from her bag, edges too clean for true regret. They were mine. I could not keep them. We seldom keep what really hurts, I said. She asked whether I thought she had killed him. Number? Your grief is borrowed, your guilt a parlour trick taught to survive the afternoon. She asked what would happen next. Poetry will continue, and truth will remain. She smiled and said I was kinder than she expected. Perhaps I was tired. Perhaps I preferred the gentleness of almosts to the clang of certainties. At the gate, I asked one last thing. Why come forward now? Because the letters sounded like me, she said, and left. I watched her go, the coat too thin for weather, the stride determined. A swan lifted, changed its mind, and settled. Sky attempted blue and failed. I stayed longer than I should, knowing the heart mistakes rehearsals for memories, and that some lies are offered because the truth is duller and therefore more dangerous. I returned to Mallory's rooms in the hour when Oxford pretends to forgive. A thin light slid along the stair rail. The corridor gave its single habitual creak, like a memory clearing its throat. The porter glanced up from his desk register, that hotel parody every college keeps to reassure itself about civility. He said nothing more than you again, and I said only for the last time, which we both knew would not be true. The room had altered by tidiness alone. Order is a disguise that never quite fits. The hearth was still laid but uncommitted, the Times folded with doctrinal care. The bed as I had left it, except for the new smoothness a nervous hand gives to linen it wishes would speak. I knelt where the sheet had told its half-truth and watched the weave shine under the window's winter light. Warmth does not remain, but the idea of warmth lingers, like perfume, remembered more than smelt. On the way out, I asked to see the register. The porter hesitated, then turned it toward me with the fatigue of someone who has grown used to the wrong kind of secrecy. The columns were neat, times entered to the minute, names that wished to be believed. One line bore a correction so careful it invited praise. 1024, visitor recorded as fellow, then overwritten fellow to read master, the darker graphite trying to teach the lighter to disappear. The porter muttered that he must have tidied a slip. He did not look at me when he said it. The master had told us dining out company, a walk home that felt like duty. He had worn his sorrow as a garment chosen for a funeral, yet the ledger disagreed with his hour and the graphite disagreed with itself. I asked the porter who first wrote fellow. He said the master had reviewed the page the next morning merely to ensure propriety, and suggested the amendment so no one would be confused. Precision, he called it. I called it rehearsal. The master received me without ceremony. He had the look of a man teaching his face to be mild. He asked whether there was progress. There is always progress, I told him, but it seldom travels in straight lines. He spoke of Mallory as colleges do, valued, difficult, irreplaceable, in ways that can be replaced. He reminded me of his dinner and his companions, named again with priestly patience. I let him finish, then mentioned the register kept like a hotel's at the gate. A small clerical confusion, he said, and smiled as if forgiving a child its mischief. I said the porter's confusion had your handwriting. He paused long enough for the clock to choose a side. He walked to the window where the quad collects regrets and said the college cannot survive scandal. I told him scandal arrives when truth is given no chair. Silence kept the next sentence company. He came late, then, with the story he had prepared, carefully frayed to look spontaneous. He had, on his way back from hall, looked up to see a light at Mallory's window. They had argued, he said, about money, about accommodation, about a complaint that would not stop multiplying. The word temper visited and left. He moved his hand once in the air, a short gesture, as if swatting an insect already dying. I said the bed was warm. He closed his eyes as a man does when he cannot bear being seen. He had tried to think what others would think. He had lifted the sheet, pressed the pillows, turned back the coverlet with the awkward care of a man handling a stranger's clothes. He had opened the window, then closed it, then opened it again, while waiting for courage to arrive, disguised as a plan. He had looked for a glass to prove company and found only the ring a glass leaves behind. In that admission lay the temperature the letter had kept. Was warm, not had been. Not memory, but vigil. He stayed, not long, long enough, he said, to feel the room hold its breath. He touched the bed because he could not touch the man. He left because morning would be less forgiving. I did not call it murder in his presence. The word would have broken more than it named. I told him the porter's book kept truer time than his alibi, and that graphite remembers what ink pretends to forget. He asked whether there was mercy in this. There is only clarity, I answered, and sometimes that is the kinder word. When I stepped back into the quad, the drizzle had begun again, soft as a scout's voice at a door. The college exhaled, and the stones smelled of old resolves. Behind me, a bed waited without sentiment for the next set of hands that would ask it to lie. The warmth had been a man's fear, not a lover's. The difference matters only to those who sleep. I walked away, thinking how often passion is accused when only restlessness keeps watch. The confession came without resistance, as if the master had rehearsed it in the solitude of his study until the words were too heavy to withhold. He sat straight in his chair, gown folded neatly across his knees, and spoke of Mallory not as friend or rival, but as an inconvenience allowed too much space. Pride was woven through every syllable, though fear lingered at the edges like damp creeping through old stone. He admitted the quarrel, the raised voice, the single striking blow. Mallory fell not with drama but with the exhausted inevitability of a man who had grown tired of standing. What followed, he said, was panic concealed in order. He turned back the sheets, pressed the pillows, left the bed rehearsing a fiction of intimacy. He lingered there, touching surfaces as though they might absorb his dread. A bed was warm, yet no one slept. The letter had not been invention but recollection, his own words disguised as warning. He said the college could not bear scandal. I told him men can live with scandal longer than with silence. He did not argue. Lewis walked beside me when we left, his tread heavier than usual on the flagstones. He tried for comfort. Justice done, truth found, order restored. I let him talk until his words tired of themselves. Comfort is a coin with little currency once the case is closed. I told him only that the warmth belonged to the wrong man, and he looked at me as if I had spoken in a language no longer taught. The quadrangle lay drenched in drizzle. Windows glowed like pages half read, staircases whispered their creaks. I thought of Clara Winters, her hand turned away in the photograph, her diary with its torn leaves, her lie that sought nobility in absence. I thought of Mallory, whose death had not been tragic enough for anyone to believe until forced. And I thought of the master, a man who had loved his college more than truth, and therefore less. Lewis said we should have a pint. I told him I preferred silence. He frowned, but did not insist. We parted at the lodge. He went toward company, I went toward solitude, each of us true to type. Back in my flat the air was close, as though it too had been keeping vigil. I poured a whiskey I did not want and opened the crossword. The clues stared with their usual mixture of mockery and promise. One remained unanswered. To rest without rest, 7. I wrote restless, then struck it out, wrote restive, and left it unfinished. Words seldom solve themselves. I stretched out on the bed, not yet undressed, and listened to the pipes shift in the walls. Beds carry more memory than people realize. They remember heat, they remember absence. They remember arguments never concluded. Mallory's bed had spoken a lie rehearsed into truth. Mine spoke nothing at all, which was worse. Outside, rain pressed harder on the glass. Oxford folded itself into evening, and the quadrangles closed like tired books. I closed my eyes but found no sleep. The warmth was there, faint but intrusive, as though another body had already claimed the space beside me and left only its residue. The case had ended, the confession secured, the college quiet again, yet none of it granted rest. The bed was warm, no one had slept,